So, a few words about the principles behind our DNA groups and how they're going to operate. See, there are reasons why we do things in life, of course. Motives, principles behind our actions. So, for example, I try to eat healthy food based on the principle that that's going to directly affect my physical well-being. I try to read the Bible and read good Christian books because of the principle that's going to directly affect my spiritual well-being. There are reasons why we do things. So what are the principles behind our DNA groups, why we're doing them and how we're doing them? There are 6, so let me give you them. The first is growth. The Christian life is one of learning, changing, moving on, developing, growing. When we think of a group of Christians, we shouldn't just think of a bunch of people who happen to believe certain things. We should have in mind a group of people who are dynamically moving, who are going somewhere. They're following Jesus, who is always doing stuff and at work, moving if you like, so we're following him. You should remember, of course, that Jesus called his first disciples to come, follow me. There was implied movement and change and progress involved in that. DNA groups are designed to help us keep moving forward on the journey as disciples and disciple-making disciples. Secondly, obedience. So we've said many times, we learn to follow Jesus by hearing him in his word, by his spirit, and through his body, and then doing whatever he tells us. Well, that's called obedience. Jesus said, of course, in the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. The goal isn't to acquire knowledge. The goal is to obey Jesus, to live with him as the Lord of our lives. DNA groups, and to be honest, every other way we're trying to make disciples, should have at their core this idea of hearing Jesus, his word, his spirit, his body, and doing whatever he tells us, obeying. These groups are going to help us with that. Thirdly, peer-to-peer. Now, each DNA group is going to have a facilitator, but no DNA group requires an expert to run it. Anyone in the church can be involved because the groups are conversation-based friendships, not teaching or material-based. They're peer-to-peer, not instructor to student. So these sessions are going to work absolutely best when friends who've learned to trust one another and know they'll be good for each other, learn to ask really good questions of each other that align with our culture, being authentic, honouring, generous and courageous. Growth, obedience, peer-to-peer, and number 4, accountability. Now, both parts of this following statement are true. To follow Jesus, we need each other and we need to accept responsibility for our own growth. Only you can live your life. Only you can decide to follow Jesus or not. But we all need relationships where we have healthy accountability to help us follow Jesus. And DNA groups are going to provide a context for conversations that have depth and intentionality as we help one another to follow and obey Jesus. 5th principle is for all. DNA groups are for anyone and everyone. So Jesus' call to go and make disciples applies to those who are not yet following him. Go and help people to know him and to follow him. But it's also true that that applies to those of us who've been Christians for decades. We still need help to follow Jesus, to be made increasingly his disciple, if you like. So we will, of course, use this material for those who are Christians already. But it will be really helpful, I believe, for those who are not yet followers of Jesus, but are interested. So you might have a friend who over time hears what you're doing, is intrigued. They're intrigued about your faith and why you believe what you do and what's it like to be a Christian. Well, you might say, well, I could invite them on a Sunday, I could invite them to a life group. Do you know what? I think this might be a really helpful context. They're happy to chat, they're happy to look in the Bible. Well, that's what you're doing in these DNA groups. It might be that you want to form one with a friend like that, or join your friend to 2 of you perhaps who are already meeting together. going to be really helpful. They are not Christian-only groups. The final principle is multiplication. Because these DNA groups are small, because they have a simple structure, and because they're conversation-based, DNA groups are easily replicable. So it'd be wise not to expect that you'll necessarily be in the same group for life, because they'll multiply. Some people might join the church and it might feel like this would be a good group for them. Well, you might pop out of that group to let them come in it, and you might form a new group with someone else. That's entirely healthy. These groups, of course, can't be more than 4 people. So they're beyond that, it requires a new group to be formed. Hopefully, over time, there'll be lots of new groups being formed out of existing groups. So 6 principles behind our DNA groups: growth, obedience, peer-to-peer, accountability for all, and multiplication. There's loads more information on our DNA groups on that part of the website.